The wind whistled through the bony trees as if in lament of something lost ages ago. A white mist hugged the earth like a shroud, curling around Kharagpur's ancient stone cottages. A village that had not felt the warmth of the sun in decades. It was said the sun avoided shining here for fear of what it would find beneath its earth. Fazal wrapped his scarf tighter against the cutting cold and looked back over his shoulder. He could sense eyes on him from the dark, though no one was there. "Do you hear that?" Farhan breathed, his voice shaking. His exhaling brought forth shallow puffs of steam, which disappeared into the suffocating mist. Fazal's legs turned to ice. Initially, he listened for something, anything other than the rustling leaves and the screeching of wooden shutters. Then it appeared, a distant whisper, one so weak that it could be imagined. But it increased in volume, grew more demanding, until it filled the air with an unsettling rhythm. "Come closer, come closer." Farhan clamped Fazal's arm. "What is that? Who's speaking?" "I don't know," whispered Fazal, "but we have to move on." They were meant to be looking for Ibad, who had disappeared 3 days ago after exploring this accursed location. Nobody volunteered to go to Kharagpur willingly, not since rumors started spreading about the haunted spirits that emerged on its streets during the night. But desperation led them along. They could not abandon their friend. As they progressed deeper into the village, the murmurs increased in volume, intermingling into a cacophony of sounds, some wailing, some shrieking, all meaningless. The structures were alive, their twisted forms hunching inwards as though plotting against intruders. Windows glared blankly, yet somehow menacingly, like empty eyes. Suddenly, Saad emerged from behind a decaying wall, making both men jump. His face was ashen, his hands trembling. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. "This place, it doesn't release people." "What are you talking about?" Fazal snapped, shaking Saad by the shoulders. "Where is Ibad?" Saad paused, looking frantically at the shadowy alleys around them. "He's altered. Something is wrong with him. We can't rescue him." Before Fazal could even answer, a blood-curdling shriek pierced the village. It wasn't of this world. It couldn't have been. The shriek hammered in their chests, racing their hearts out of control. And then, complete silence. Kharagpur had not always been such a place. Long ago, centuries ago, it had flourished under the protective shadows of the mountains, its fields green with yield and its people happy. But success bred hubris, and hubris had brought destruction. The villagers described a devastating famine that came out of nowhere, causing neighbor to turn against neighbor. Madness stemmed from desperation, and the villagers ended up turning to cannibalism. When the very last survivor eventually perished, their troubled spirits remained, stuck to the earth due to shame and despair. Fazal was familiar with these stories. Everyone was. Raised on the periphery of the accursed village, he'd heard them shared in hushed tones late at night, or grumbled as a cautionary tale when someone strayed too near. Hearing stories and entering Kharagpur, though, were two very different matters. The air itself seemed to be denser here, heavy, as if the burden of infinite transgressions weighed down upon them. Farhan broke the uneasy quiet. "If Ibad's still alive, we'll find him. If he's gone." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "We won't give up," Fazal said firmly, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. "Not until we're sure." Saad shook his head, his face grim. "You don't get it. This isn't a haunted village or anything. Whatever is here, it feeds on fear. The more afraid you are, the more powerful it becomes." As if to substantiate his claim, the whispers came back, louder this time, churning around them like a tempest. Phrases emerged in the midst of the din, names, cries, accusations, but none were intelligible. Faisal balled his fists, attempting to shut out the sounds, but they filtered into his brain, sowing seeds of suspicion. Was that his mother's voice calling for assistance? Or his little sister wailing in agony? "Focus!" Saad snapped, grabbing Fazal's arm. "Don't listen to it, it's trying to break you." Fazal blinked rapidly, shaking his head to clear the haze. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's keep going." The three pushed on, making their way through the twisting streets of Kharagpur. Every step was heavier than the last, as if chains pulled at their ankles unseen. The mist grew thicker, visibility dwindling to a few feet. Shadows writhed on the walls, contorting into monstrous forms before melting back into nothingness. It was Farhan who saw it first, a flash of movement in a window nearby. "Did you see that?" he said, nodding toward a dilapidated house with boarded windows. "See what?" Fazal said, looking into the darkness. "There was someone, or something, looking at us." Saad moved forward tentatively, looking into the vacant area where Farhan had pointed. "Likely just your imagination running away with you," he said derisively. But even while he was saying it, a low groan came from inside the house, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps over wooden floorboards. Abruptly, the front entrance burst open and slammed against the wall with a force that splintered the wood. A shape stumbled out, its body shrouded in tattered rags and matted hair. Its head hung loosely to one side, showing milky white eyes without pupils. The odor of rot rolled towards them, and the group had to cover their faces and noses. "What the devil is that?" Farhan gasped, retreating slowly. "It's one of them," Saad breathed, his voice shaking. "One of the damned." The beast darted forward with jerky, but somehow terrifying speed. Fazal pushed Farhan out of the way just in time, as the creature slapped at him with its fingers like claws. Saad rummaged for a flashlight and played the light straight into the face of the beast. It stumbled back for a moment, emitting an ear-piercing shriek that sent birds flying off the rooftops. "Run!" Faisal yelled, grabbing hold of Farhan's arm and yanking him down the nearest alleyway. Saad trailed close behind, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The monster chased them without respite, its guttural roars booming through the narrow corridors. They ran between dilapidated buildings, their boots splashing in puddles of stagnant water. The deeper they ran, the thicker the mist grew, hiding their trail and confusing them. Finally, they reached a dead end, trapped between a towering brick wall and the relentless pursuer. The creature loomed closer, its grotesque features illuminated by the dim light of Saad's flashlight. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth stained with dried blood. "This is it," Farhan whimpered, sinking to his knees. "We're done for." "No," Fazal said sharply, his voice cutting through the panic. "We fight." He looked about wildly, his eyes catching on a loose cobblestone beside him. Seizing it, he threw all his might behind the stone, striking the beast in the head. The impact made it reel backward, gaining them valuable seconds to reorient themselves. "Over here," Saad shouted, gesturing to a rusty iron gate half buried in ivy. They struggled together to push it open, making it just in time as the creature regained its balance. The gate creaked shut behind them, confining the beast on the opposite side, at least for the moment. Panting, the three fell onto the wet ground, their bodies shuddering with fatigue and adrenaline. For a moment, all that could be heard was their labored breathing and the far-off creak of the gate groaning against the beast's rage. As they panted, Faisal realized something was strange about where they were. They had wandered into what seemed to be an old cemetery, its gravestones slanted at strange angles and overgrown with moss. A huge mausoleum loomed in the middle of the clearing, its door covered with thick iron bars. "What are we doing here?" Farhan cried, his tone laced with hysteria. "This is worse than the village." "We needed somewhere safe to hide," Saad explained, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. "Besides, maybe we'll find answers." Answers. One word ignited a spark of hope within Fazal's breast. If anybody would know what went on at Kharagpur, it would be here, among the dead. Going to the mausoleum, he looked at the lock that held the bars in place. It was old and rusted, something easily broken with enough force. "Help me with this," he told Saad and Farhan, nodding toward the bars. Together they were able to loosen the bars, exposing a set of stone steps leading into darkness. "Are you crazy?" Farhan complained. "No way I'm going down there." "You want to remain here with that beast?" Saad replied, pointing towards the gate where the beast kept clawing and snarling. Reluctantly, Farhan nodded and fell into line behind the others into the depths. The way down was slow and perilous, every step with the ominous groan of aged stone. The air chilled with each second, with the slight smell of dirt and rot wafting through it. They arrived at the bottom in a small room with shelves full of dry bones and worn relics. In the middle of the room was a pedestal, on which lay a book bound in leather. The pages were yellowed with age, and there were odd symbols on the cover. Fazal drew near with caution, tracing his fingers over the intricate carvings. "What is this?" he whispered, opening the book and finding words written in a language that none of them could read. "It's a diary," Saad speculated, hunching in for a better view. Perhaps it belonged to the previous occupant. As Fazal turned the pages, pieces of the past unrolled. Journal entries spoke of rituals done to placate a being known as only the Veil. Animals were first offered, and then humans, as the villagers prayed for rescue from their anguish. But instead of deliverance, the rituals released something far more sinister, trapping the spirits of the dead in the mortal realm. These individuals cursed themselves. Saad breathed, his face ashen. "And anyone who ventures here is equal to them." Before Faisal could answer, the floor beneath their feet shook uncontrollably. Dust poured from the ceiling, and a low roar spread through the room. Eyes glowed in the shadows, red, dozens of them, watching but not moving. "They've found us," Farhan whimpered, holding on to Saad's arm. The past of Kharakpur was tragic. Centuries before, it had been a prosperous village with rich soil and colorful festivals. That was before the massacre. Legend has it that the villagers attacked one another during a famine, their minds crazed by hunger and desperation. When the last survivor died, their restless spirits were stuck in the village, unable to rest. Natsi shifted her flashlight uneasily as she told the story to Anam and Huma, who crouched together beside the ruined church at the village center. The building towered over them, its spire splintered and broken, its tall shadows twisting across the courtyard. "That's just a story," Anam grumbled, though her large eyes also showed doubt. "People don't remain dead." "Oh, they do here," Natsish said with a frown, "and they're furious. As if on cue, the ground they stood on vibrated ever so slightly. Dust rained from the church's rafters, and a rumbling groan echoed from someplace far down below. The noise made them shiver in unison. "We have to leave here," Huma pleaded, holding fast to Anam's arm. But as they moved to go, the huge oak doors of the church thundered shut behind them with a deafening boom. From beyond them, muted laughter burst from the darkness, giggles that immediately degenerated into cackling madness. In the distance, Umair shouted their names, his voice frantic. As they rushed toward the sound, they stumbled upon a horrifying sight. Raza lying unconscious on the cobblestones, his body contorted unnaturally. Blood pooled beneath him, though none of them could see any wounds. "What happened to him?" Anam gasped, tears streaming down her face. Nazish knelt next to Raza, her hand shaking as she felt for his pulse. I think whatever is haunting this place got to him." A blast of wind blew out their flashlights, leaving them in the dark. From close by, a voice whispered right into Natsish's ear. "Your turn next." As they stood frozen in the choking darkness, Natsish's thoughts ran back to the tales her grandmother told. She had always written them off as mere myth, warning stories told to keep children in line and out of harm's way. But now, those stories pulsed like a wild thing in the darkness, scratching at the corners of her mind. Her grandmother told her of the Veil, a dark presence that lived between worlds, sustaining itself on fear and despair. It was said that the villagers, in the time of the famine, had rituals to call it forth, praying for deliverance. They called forth an entity that devoured their souls and tied them to the earth. Those who were not killed in the first massacre were doomed to relive their worst moments forever. Natsish shuddered, remembering one specific detail. The Veil not only trapped spirits, it warped them. The inhabitants of Karakpur over time became something far different from human. They were shadows of what they once were, empty husks consumed by insatiable anger and grief. "This is not real," Anam whispered, trembling. "This cannot be happening." "It is," Nazish said, a grimness in her voice. "And we have to get out of here. Remaining here will only worsen things." She groped blindly, her hand brushing against Anam's sleeve. Anam and she pulled Raza's unconscious form towards the direction of Umair's voice. Every step was like walking through molasses, the suffocating atmosphere bearing down on them. The whispers came back, louder this time, blurring into a chaos of voices that seemed to issue from all around them. "Who's there?" Umair shouted again, his voice edged with fear. "We're coming!" Natsish yelled back, although she wasn't certain he could hear her above the noise. At last, they came out into a tiny clearing where Umair stood, his flashlight casting an unstable beam. His face was white, his eyes scanning wildly. "What did you do to him?" he demanded, pointing to Raza. "I don't know," Nazish confessed. "But we can't remain here. We must find shelter." Umair nodded, assisting her in standing Raza up on his feet. The unconscious man moaned lightly, but gave no indication of stirring. As they proceeded, the group saw weird symbols carved on the cobblestones at their feet. Others glowed faintly, with an otherworldly light pulsating from them that distorted on the walls in sickly, unnatural shadows. "These weren't here before," Huma breathed, running one hand over the edge of a marking. "What do they signify?" "No idea," Natsish said, "but I don't think they're good news." Their route took them back to the church, its looming shape silhouetted against the darkness. In spite of their previous experience, it looked like the best bet, at least for the moment. Pushing through the heavy oak doors, they entered, met with a blast of cold air that had a faint scent of incense and rot. The inside was huge and hulking, lined with row upon row of pews lined in dust-stained layers of grime. At the very back stood a tattered altar covered in soiled black that was topped with a lone burning candle, its flame a deathly green hue. The walls were covered with faded frescoes that showed their scenes of despair and redemption being muted by use and abandonment over time. "This freaks me out," Anam grumbled, hugging herself. "Better than being outside," Umair replied, putting Raza down carefully on one of the pews. "At least here we have walls." Natsish stepped up to the altar hesitantly, attracted by the otherworldly light of the candle. As she leaned in, she saw something carved into the bottom, a set of runes exactly like those they'd encountered outside. Her heart fell as understanding dawned. "This isn't a church," she breathed, turning to the others. "It's a prison." Before anyone could answer, the candle guttered and extinguished, darkening the room again. There was a low thrumming in the air, increasing in volume until it vibrated against their chests. Then, from the darkness, shapes started to materialize, dozens of them, their bodies glowing yet unmistakably human. "They're here," Huma whined, retreating slowly. The apparitions floated nearer, their faces contorted in torment. Some of them stretched out pleadingly, while others screamed silently, their mouths opening ridiculously wide. One of them caught Natsish's eye, a woman in frayed robes, her eyes empty pits of despair. She floated right in front of Nazish, stretching out a skeletal hand. "Help us," she breathed, her voice a mere whisper. "Free us." Nazish jumped back in surprise, colliding with Umair. "Don't touch them!" she shouted, panic rising in her voice. The spirits charged, enveloping the group. Their presence was oppressive, filling the air with an almost tangible fear. Just when it seemed as though they would be engulfed, a shattering crash echoed through the church. The enormous stained glass window exploded, showering the room with shards of colored glass. Across the open space, a figure in black stepped through the wide opening, its face hidden behind a veil. In its hand, it grasped a staff of bone, its tip capped with a crystal that seemed to throb with dark magic. The spirits shrank away the moment they saw it, retreating into the darkness as if by an invisible force. "Who or what are you?" demanded Nazish, her tone firm in spite of the horror raging through her body. The figure cocked its head, regarding them in silence. And then, out of nowhere, it brought up the staff, pointing it at Raza straight on. A shaft of red light shot out, hitting him squarely in the chest. He jerked spastically, his eyes flying open as he emitted a tortured scream. "What are you doing to him?" Ainam shouted, hurrying to his side. The figure lowered the staff, moving closer. Its voice, when it spoke at last, was low and sonorous, echoing through the chamber like a death bell. "He is marked," it said. "The veil has claimed him." Raza's body stiffened, his eyes rolling back in his head. When he spoke, his voice was not his own. It was a chorus of whispers, layered and dissonant. "You can't escape," he growled, standing up. "None of you can." Hysteria broke as Raza attacked them, his actions jerky and robotic. Umair brought him down to the floor, fighting to keep him pinned as Anam and Huma rushed to assist. Nazish remained paralyzed, her thoughts tumbling. Whatever had possessed Raza was strong and unrelenting. "Keep him still," Umair gritted through his teeth, trying to wrestle back from Raza's increased strength. Nazish came out of her trance, picking up a piece of broken glass off the ground. Taking a deep breath, she drove it into Raza's shoulder. He shrieked an unearthly sound, crumpling to the ground as the light disappeared from his eyes. There was a moment of silence. Then, gradually, Raza struggled to his feet, looking up at them in confusion. What happened?" he croaked, his voice hoarse and weak. "You were under control," Nazish told him, kneeling by his side. "That thing, the figure in the cloak, it did something to you." Raza winced, massaging his temples. "I don't recall anything after discovering the journal." "The journal?" Nazish cut in quickly. "What journal?" Raza hesitated, looking nervously at the others. "I discovered it in the mausoleum. It talked about a ritual, a means of lifting the curse. But I believe I made a wrong move." "A mistake?" Umair repeated in amazement. "What sort of mistake?" Before Raza could respond, the hooded figure reappeared, emerging from the shadows as if conjured out of thin air. It raised its staff again, this time pointing it at the group. "You interfere with things you do not comprehend," it said, its voice full of venom. "The veil requires sacrifice, and you will give it." At the wave of a staff, the church walls groaned and curled, closing in on them. The pieces of stained glass soared into the air, whirling furiously like splinters from a shattered mirror. The vengeful spirits came back, flying around them like vultures waiting to pounce. "We have to fight back!" Nazish bellowed, snatching another shard of glass. "We can't let it win!" But even while she spoke, uncertainty gnawed at her determination. How could they possibly expect to beat an entity which had survived for centuries? What hope did ordinary mortals have against such venerable evil? As if feeling her uncertainty, the veiled figure stepped forward, its veil billowing in an invisible wind. Underneath it, Nazish saw something unutterable. a nothingness where a face ought to have been, filled with infinite, twisting blackness. "Join us," it breathed, its voice resonating in their minds. "Embrace the veil." By this time, the gang knew they weren't alone. Each step became a struggle, as if hands that could not be felt were tugging them backward. Israr went first, gripping a rusty knife he had picked up along the way. Bravado aside, sweat trickled down his brow, and his hold on the knife wavered. "These are crazy," Sanya cursed under her breath. She trailed behind, holding a frayed map of the village. "There must be an escape." "There isn't," Ikra growled, her temper thinning. "Did you hear what Saad told us? This thing is fueled by fear. The more we're afraid, the stronger it becomes." Her words lay in the air like poison, settling into every head. Fear clawed at their determination, promising to consume them whole. When they arrived at the ancient well on the outskirts of the village, events turned dark. Voices burst forth from the depths, crying out their names, offering salvation or damnation. Each member of the group leaned in, one by one, irresistibly drawn to the void. "Don't look," Israr yelled, catching Sanya just as she leaned perilously close to the brink. Her eyes widened, her face blank, as if she were possessed. But it was too late for Ikra. With a guttural cry, she rushed towards the well, falling into the darkness below. A moment later, her screams were heard echoing back up, twisted and unrecognizable. And then, silence. Out of the shadows stepped a figure dressed in black, its face hidden behind a veil. It reached out a bony hand towards the other survivors, inviting them closer. The ancient well stood at the center of Karakpur, its stone lip broken and green with moss. Once a source of life for the villagers, giving them water in times of abundance. Now, a portal to something far sinister, a vector for the veil itself. When they stood around it, the whispers grew more intense, interweaving their minds like malicious threads. Sanya writhed in Israr's grasp, her body shuddering convulsively. "Let me go," she implored, sobs running down her face. "I must see. I must know." "No," Israr growled, clenching his arm tighter. "Whatever is down there, it's not worth it." He looked nervously at the others, hoping for support, but they were paralyzed, stuck on the sinister beauty of the well. Even Raza, who had partially come to after the church attack, appeared under its spell. His eyes grew glassy as he moved in closer, muttering nonsensically to himself. "What was it that you discovered in that journal?" Natsish begged, shaking him firmly. "Tell me immediately." Raza blinked, shattering the trance for an instant. "It spoke of ending the curse," he stuttered. "A ritual, but sacrifices, blood, agony. I could have halted it, but instead..." His words trailed away as a new scream erupted from the well, this one beyond doubt Ikra's. The shriek ran cold fingers down their spines, a ghastly reminder of what would befall anyone reckless enough to answer the veil's call. "We can't tarry here," Umair insisted, nervously eyeing the shadows around them. "Those things are returning." Indeed, the air cooled, and the mist took on faint outlines. The ghosts of Karakpur were back, their lights dancing like candle flame in a gust of wind. Some moved quietly, others moaned pitifully, their sounds mingling with the ceaseless sighs that arised from the well. Israr pushed Sanya towards the others, making her concentrate. "Snap out of it," he snarled. "We don't have time for this." Sanya gasped quickly, her breathing choppy. Clarity resurfaced in her eyes for a moment. "I'm sorry," she murmured, holding her head. I couldn't resist." "You will the next time," Israr said sternly, "because if you don't, none of us are leaving alive." Before they could reorganize, the hooded figure returned, emerging from the shadows with a ghostly elegance. Its staff glowed with malevolent power, throwing an unnatural light over the clearing. The spirits drew back involuntarily, leaving a broad circle around the being. "You cannot flee," it spoke, its voice a dirge-like murmur. The veil requires balance, life for death, flesh for spirit. Natsish advanced, jaw set in fury. "Why are you doing this?" she shouted. "What do you stand to gain from torturing us?" The figure cocked its head to one side, examining her intently. Below the veil, the emptiness rippled and gave way to fleeting glimpses of squirming tendrils that appeared almost alive. "Balance must be kept," it said obliquely. "Your interference throws the cycle off. You owe a toll." "Then take me," Natsish offered boldly, spreading her arms wide. "Leave the others alone." "No!" Anam cried, rushing to pull her back. "You can't sacrifice yourself." Natsish ignored her, locking eyes with the figure. "If my life will end this nightmare, then so be it." For an instant, the being paused, as though weighing her proposal. Then, with a flick of its staff, it called forth a blast of wind that sent Natsish tumbling to the ground. She gasped for breath as the figure towered above her. "Sacrifice is meaningless without consent," it stated. "Fear is the currency of the veil. Your terror fuels its power." As if to prove the point, the whispers grew louder, churning around them like a maelstrom. Every voice bore pieces of memories. Childhood terror, old wounds, buried regrets. The group covered their heads, buckling under the barrage. "This is how it shatters us," Huma whispered, falling to her knees. "It turns our own minds against us." "We need to fight back," Israr bellowed, holding up the dagger proudly. "We can't let it win." But even as he said it, uncertainty crept into his tone. How could they ever hope to defeat something that lived off their fear? What could kill something born of despair? In the midst of the chaos, Raza straightened up abruptly, his face determined. "I know how to end it," he declared, his tone firm in spite of the pandemonium surrounding them. "Then how?" Natsish asked dubiously, hauling herself to her feet. "Last time you attempted it, Ikre died." "I was wrong," Raza confessed, shame etched on his face. "But I get it now. The ritual wasn't supposed to shatter the curse. It was supposed to keep it contained, to trap the veil away forever." "And how do we exactly do that?" Umair asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Raza hesitated, looking nervously at the cloaked figure. "We must do the ritual ourselves, but it needs all of us, together." "Both of us?" Sanya asked, her voice shaking. "Even if we decide, how do we know it will work?" "We don't," Raza answered bluntly. "But it's our best hope." The group exchanged uneasy glances, weighing their options. They knew staying in Karakpur meant certain death, but performing a ritual tied to such dark forces carried its own risks. Trusting Raza again felt like gambling with their lives. Finally, Israr nodded. "Fine, let's do it. But if this goes wrong, I'm blaming you." Raza managed a weak smile. "Fair enough." Following the journal's instructions, the group stood in a circle around the well. Each one of them carried a piece of chalk, with which they inscribed symbols on the ground exactly like those carved into the cobblestones around the village. The air was charged with tension as they did this, the cloaked figure standing by, observing silently. When the preparations were complete, Raza stepped into the center of the circle, holding the journal open to a specific page. "This is it," he said solemnly. "Once we start, there's no turning back." "What happens if we fail?" Anam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We die," Raza replied simply. "Or worse." Not waiting for any more questions, he started chanting in a tongue that none of them knew. The words came easily, each syllable vibrating with a supernatural strength. With every word he uttered, the symbols on the floor started to shimmer, pulsating along with the beat of his words. The hooded figure moved, its staff shaking in its hand. For the first time, it was restless, pacing back and forth as the ritual continued. The spirits themselves also moved in a frenzy, screaming and lashing at the periphery of the circle as if they would burst through. "Go on," Natsish encouraged, holding Raza's shoulder for balance. "Don't falter." But just when the ritual had reached its climax, a deafening roar ripped through the air. The earth shook beneath them, cracking spiderweb fashion outward. Black smoke boiled up from the well, solidifying into a frightful creature towering above them. "You challenge the Veil?" It thundered, its voice shaking the earth itself. "Fools, you will join the others." With the swipe of its huge hand, it broke the protective ring, sending the group scattering like leaves blown by a hurricane. Raza crashed to the floor, the journal slipping from his fingers. The hooded figure took advantage, plunging forward to snatch it. "No exclamation mark," Nazi shouted, grabbing the creature in mid-stride. They fell to the ground, fighting for possession of the staff. Sparks erupted as their battle-fueled bursts of dark energy, lighting up the hellish tableau. The others struggled to reform, taking up a defensive line against the advancing spirits. Israr used the dagger with unexpected proficiency, parrying blows while yelling encouragement to the others. "Stay together," he barked, slashing at a spectral figure that lunged at Sanya. "We're stronger as a team." Despite their efforts, the tide turned against them. The Veil's manifestation grew larger, its form shifting unpredictably as it absorbed the fear radiating from the group. One by one, the spirits overwhelmed them, dragging them toward the well. "We're losing," Huma sobbed, clinging desperately to Umair as a pair of ghostly hands pulled at her legs. "Not yet!" Nazi shouted, finally wresting the staff from the cloaked figure. With a primal scream, she drove it into the ground, channeling every ounce of her willpower into the act. A blinding flash of light exploded, surrounding the clearing in raw white brilliance. The Veil gave one last ear-piercing shriek before crumbling into nothingness. The spirits were gone, leaving behind nothing but silence. As darkness closed in, the group slumped onto the ground, weary but alive. The hooded figure remained still beside them, its veil rent asunder to expose an empty space. The well likewise had shut itself off, its edge unbroken and smooth. "What just happened?" Farhan asked, massaging his temples. "We stopped it," Natsish croaked back, her throat raw. For now?" Raza asked, furrowing his brow. "You mean it's not gone?" Nazi shook her head firmly. "The Veil is a part of this location. We kept it in, but it's still here, waiting." The first light of the sun cut through the horizon, painting Karakpur in a washed-out gold. It was something none of them believed they would ever witness again. A moment of brief warmth in a land that had been shrouded in darkness for so long. But even as the light swept the shadows aside, it couldn't shake off the growing terror that clung to the survivors like a second skin. Natsish sat cross-legged on the soggy ground, her hands shaking as she gripped the staff she had employed to drive out the Veil. Its surface was now cold, free of the dark energy that had flowed through it only hours before. She gazed at it fixedly, her thoughts reliving the events of the night. Had they really contained the thing, or only postponed its eventual return? "We need to leave," Israr interrupted abruptly, ending the silence. His voice was rough from yelling during the fight, but his tone had an air of urgency that caused everyone to look up. "Now, before something else occurs." "No," Nazish replied harshly, standing up. "We can't leave, not yet." "Why not?" Sanya asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "We stopped it, didn't we? Isn't that enough?" Natsish wavered, looking in the direction of the sealed well. "It's not gone," she said quietly. "The Veil remains, dormant perhaps, but alive. If we abandon it without knowing what we are dealing with, it'll break free in another way." Her words dangled in the air, heavy as lead weights, sinking into the group. They knew she was correct. Karakpur wasn't finished with them. But to remain meant endangering everything they had struggled so fiercely to keep. Raza advanced, his face set. If we're going to remain, we have questions, and I believe I know where to begin. Raza took them back to the mausoleum where he had found the journal before. The entrance was half collapsed now, probably because of the tremors brought about by their battle with the Veil. Nevertheless, they were able to squeeze through the small opening, going down again into the damp chamber below. Inside, the air reeked with the smell of rot and wet stone. The pedestal where the journal had previously rested now lay over on its side, its surface cracked and splintered. Raza was kneeling beside it, sweeping away what debris he could until he exposed a concealed compartment at the base. "Whatever is that?" Ainam asked, looking over his shoulder. "Looks like a map," said Raza, extracting a rolled-up parchment. Unrolling it with caution, he displayed a complex diagram of Karakpur, with markings much like the ones they had noticed carved into the cobblestones and etched around the well. "These symbols, there are so many," Nadzish whispered, following one of the symbols with her finger. "But what are they supposed to mean?" "They're wards," Raza said, his forehead creased in thought. Protection spells meant to seal the veil in. Many of them have worn away or been broken through the centuries, which is why it became stronger. "So mending them could make the seal stronger?" Umair asked, his tone optimistic. "Perhaps," Raza agreed, "but it won't be simple. Some of these places are hidden deep underground, or worse, protected by whatever remains of the spirits." As if cueing her, the floor shook slightly, with a low rumble resonating through the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling, and soft whispers crept into the room, increasing in intensity with every second. "We don't have much time left," Huma whispered, grasping Ainam's arm tightly. "They're returning." The map showed that the closest ward was underneath the old church, a piece of information that made the group uncomfortable. Going back to the place where they had their last encounter was like going voluntarily into a lion's den. But they had no other option. Each passing moment raised the chances of the Veil escaping. The church was ominously quiet when they entered, its broken stained glass window casting broken shafts of light upon the floor. The altar was untouched, although the green flame had burned itself out. Nadzish moved warily, her gaze sweeping the walls for any indication of the symbols. "There," Farhan exclaimed, pointing to a portion of the wall adjacent to the altar. Indeed, subtle carvings were apparent under the grime and dust that coated them. "How do we trigger it?" Sanya asked apprehensively, keeping a safe distance from the markings. "I don't know," Raza confessed, "but from what I have read, we'll need to impart energy into it in some way. Perhaps using the staff?" Nadzish nodded, stepping forward with the staff in hand. When she applied its tip to the symbol, a surge of warmth spread outward, making the carving glow dimly. The whispers grew louder, eddying around them like a tempest. "That's it!" Raza exclaimed, his voice trembling with excitement. "Keep going!" But no sooner did Nadzish concentrate her energy than the earth below them collapsed, flinging them over into an unsuspected passage underneath. They came down harshly on wet stone, flashlights flying off in every direction. "Well, that's just swell," Israr grumbled under his breath, massaging aching ribs. Before anyone could say anything, footsteps sounded down the corridor in front of them. Deliberate, slow footsteps that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. "Who's there?" Nadzish shouted out, holding her flashlight up to light the way. Out of the darkness came a figure in tattered robes, its face hidden beneath a hood. It carried a lantern, with blue flames dancing within. As it approached, the group saw that it was not human, at least not anymore. Its skin was transparent, and they could see flashes of bone underneath, and its movements were jerky, but somehow unnervingly precise. "You trespass," it croaked, its voice composed of several tones. "Leave this place. We're trying to repair what your kind destroyed," Nazish retorted boldly, positioning herself between the creature and the others. "Assist us, and perhaps you can now rest." The figure cocked its head, regarding her with interest. Suddenly, without warning, it launched itself forward, wielding the lantern as a club. Nazish dodged barely in time, the warmth of the flames burning her sleeve. "Spread out," Israr yelled, drawing the dagger he still wore. "Don't let it corner us." The battle was disorganized, the cramped space making it hard to move. The creature moved with unnatural quickness, its attacks wild and relentless. Just when they were beginning to get the better of it, reinforcements showed up, more ghostly figures materializing from the darkness, their forms wavering like candle flames in a draft. "We can't hold them off forever," Umair yelled, fending off a spirit with a makeshift club fashioned from a broken pew. "We don't have to," Raza shouted back, gesturing toward a large iron door at the end of the corridor. "Get to the door, I'll cover you." Reluctantly, the others obeyed, retreating toward the exit while Raza stood his ground, holding the journal aloft. He began chanting in the same ancient language he had used during the ritual, his voice resonating with power. The spirits hesitated, their forms wavering as if caught in an invisible wind. "Go," Raza urged, his voice strained. "I'll catch up." Nazish hesitated, caught between assisting him and protecting the others. At last, she nodded, going through the door with the group as Raza slammed it shut behind them. Across the door, they entered a great chamber with mirror-lined walls. Every surface displayed their frightened faces back at them, twisted and distorted as though laughing at their misfortune. In the room's center stood a pedestal, very much like that in the mausoleum, upon which sat a glowing crystal orb imbued with a strange silver radiance. "Where is this?" Anam whispered, her voice shaking. "It's another ward," Raza said, materializing suddenly behind them. He was pale and sweaty, but otherwise all right. "This orb boosts the protective magic. We must activate it." "How?" Sanya asked, glancing at the mirrors uneasily. Something about them seemed off, as if they weren't just reflecting reality. "We channel our energy into it," Raza said. "All of us. At once." Each in turn, they laid their hands on the orb, shutting their eyes as they focused. A gentle hum filled the air, increasing in volume as the orb started to throb with light. The mirrors rippled in response, their surfaces undulating like water. And then, the reflections shifted. Rather than reflecting their present selves, the mirrors revealed alternate versions of them, twisted, evil doppelgangers with empty eyes and sadistic grins. These reflections emerged from the glass one by one, encircling the group with sinister purpose. "This isn't happening," Huma whimpered, retreating slowly. "This can't be real." "It's the veil," Nazish realized, her voice constricted with fear. "It's playing on our fears again." The duplicates moved forward, their actions synchronized and deliberate. They were all similar to their counterparts, but had minute differences. Israr's duplicate carried a knife with blood on it, whereas Nazish's doppelganger had a staff encircled with black flames. "We have to battle them," Israr bellowed, rushing towards his duplicate with mad abandon. The others joined in, attacking their counterparts in violent battles. The battles were surreal, each person forced to confront their darkest impulses and insecurities. Nazish found herself locked in a struggle with her reflection, their staffs clashing violently as sparks flew. Her double taunted her relentlessly, exploiting every doubt and regret she had ever harbored. "You're weak," it sneered, parrying her blows effortlessly. "You'll never be strong enough to stop the veil." "No!" Nazish cried out, calling on all the resolve she could muster. With one final, desperate blow, she broke the illusion, her attack sending it flying apart into mist. Each of the others in turn overpowered their doubles, falling to the floor in exhaustion. The mirrors reverted to normal, their glass unbroken and smooth. The orb glowed brightly again before finally fading out. It worked, Raza gasped, sliding against the pedestal for support. The ward is active. As they huddled outside the mirror room, the stifling atmosphere at Kharagpur felt a little less oppressive. The whispers were gone, replaced with an uneasy silence. For the first time since arriving at the village, they felt the hope that perhaps they might live after all, but their solace was short-lived. On their way back to the surface, the robed figure resurfaced in front of them, barring the way. Its veil danced tauntingly, with flashes of the emptiness below. "You have slowed the inevitable," it hissed, its words laced with venom. "But the veil will resurface, and when it does, none of you will live." And in it, with that, it disappeared into thin air, leaving only the faint smell of sulfur. The survivors crawled out of the subterranean tunnels into the pale dawn light, their bodies bruised and their morale tattered. Kharagpur was abnormally quiet around them, as if it too was waiting for what was to befall. The stifling presence of the veil had receded, but it still remained, a nagging reminder that their triumph was short-lived at best. Nazish gripped the staff hard, her knuckles white on the weathered wood. She looked at the others, all of them showing the physical and emotional toll of their experience. Israr's shirt was ripped, revealing a jagged cut across his ribs where his double had cut him. Sonia's hands shook as she readjusted her flashlight, her eyes flicking nervously to the shadows. Even Raza, who had remained the most collected all along on their journey, appeared exhausted, his face gaunt and his movements slow. "We have to keep going," Nazish finally spoke up, shattering the strained silence. "If we can reactivate the last of the wards, we may be able to hold the veil in place once and for all." "Once and for all?" Anam repeated doubtfully, her voice shaking. "Or until it discovers another method of breaking out?" Nazish hesitated, realizing Anam's fears were not without reason. "We have no other choice," she conceded softly. "If we quit now, all we have worked for will be in vain." Raza nodded, spreading the map out again. "There are 3 wards remaining," he said, tapping the locations indicated on the parchment. "One by the old mill, one under the cemetery, and the last one within the village square. They each correspond to a unique part of the ritual, the binding, the sealing, and the anchor." "And what if we get even one wrong?" Umair growled. "Then the seal won't hold," Raza responded curtly. "And the veil will destroy us all." Their first stop was the ancient mill, which stood on the edge of the village. Once a thriving center of activity in Kharagpur's heyday, it now sat as a ruin, its wooden supports warped and splintered with age. The air around it had a faint tang of rust and rot, mixed with the constant cold that filled the accursed village. As they drew near, the air was filled with the grinding of gears, though no machinery was left intact. The sound appeared to come from inside the building itself, echoing abnormally loud as if taunting their presence. "This place is creepy," Farhan whispered, holding a piece of splintered timber like a club. "It feels alive." "It likely is," Nazish said grimly, eyeing the ruined building for any signs of threat. "Be on your guard." Within, the mill was a maze of rot and fallen timbers. Puddles of standing water cast reflected images of the faint light that seeped through cracks in the walls, twisting them into distorted shapes that moved across the ceiling. The grinding intensified, joined by soft whispers that seemed to move within the walls themselves. "There!" Raza exclaimed, pointing to a part of the floor covered by rubble. Under the dirt, there were faint carvings, symbols that were the same as the ones they had encountered earlier. "How do we trigger it?" Huma asked apprehensively, looking over her shoulder as if something was going to jump out at them. "Just the way we did before," Nazish said, advancing with staff held in her hand. "But get ready. Whatever's protecting this ward won't take kindly to us." She thrust the point of the staff at the symbol, pouring energy into the old magic. The etchings took on a blue glow, spreading an unearthly light over the room. Within seconds, the whispers grew loud, rushing past them in waves. Out of the darkness came men dressed in tattered robes, their faces hidden behind hoods. Unlike the ghostly warders they had seen before, these men were substantial, their steps slow and threatening. They wielded scythes made of blackened steel, the blades glinting malevolently in the faint light. "Reapers," Raza breathed, his voice laced with fear. "They're tied to the mill, to make sure no one gets in the way of the binding ritual." No one had a chance to react before the Reapers charged, swinging their scythes with the precision of death. The group dispersed, dodging the fatal curves of the scythes by mere inches. Israr tackled one of the monsters, plunging his dagger into its chest, but the blade went through harmlessly, as if striking air. "They're not human," he yelled, rolling away from the Reaper as it brought its scythe down. "Concentrate on the ward," Nazi ordered, holding up the staff protectively as two Reapers moved in on her. "Don't let them interrupt us!" Raza came to stand beside her, chanting in the old tongue again. The symbols glowed stronger, the blue light radiating outward in waves. The Reapers stepped back involuntarily, their bodies wavering like candle flames in a gust of wind. "Keep going," Nazi urged, using the staff to deflect a scythe aimed at her head. "We're almost there." With a final surge of energy, the ward activated, bathing the entire mill in blinding light. The Reapers let out unearthly shrieks as their forms dissolved into mist, leaving behind only silence. Their next destination was the cemetery, a vast area of slanted headstones and dilapidated mausoleums. The air was denser here, redolent with the smell of dirt and rot. Shadows crept abnormally long, twisting the terrain into something unreal and disturbing. "This place is not right," Sonia whispered, holding the map close. "As if it's looking at us." "It is," Raza said firmly. "The dead never really rest in Kharakpur." They walked down the maze-like corridors carefully, their steps silenced by the yielding soil under their boots. The second ward was supposed to be located below a crescent moon-marked crypt, according to the map, a symbol representing sealing rituals. When they reached the crypt, they found its entrance sealed with heavy iron bars. Rust coated the metal, making it nearly impossible to budge. "We'll have to break it open," Israr suggested, gripping the bars and pulling with all his strength. The others joined in, their combined efforts finally prying the gate loose. Within, the crypt was chilly and humid, the walls covered in shelves stacked with dry bones and yellowed relics. A pedestal sat at the center of the room, upon which sat a worn leather-bound book looking identical to the one Raza had found beforehand. "That's it," said Raza, walking forward slowly. "The sealing ritual." But when he opened the book, the earth under them shook so violently. Dust poured in from the ceiling, and the sound of a deep rumbling filled the room. From the darkness came glowing red eyes, dozens of them, staring impassively. "They've found us," Huma whimpered, slowly backing away. The spirits burst forward, engulfing the group. They hung in the air, suffocating the senses with their overwhelming presence of foreboding dread. At the last instant, a blaring crash echoed within the crypt. The massive stone sarcophagus in the corner exploded, pieces of rock plummeting downwards. Out of the yawning void stepped a figure wrapped in black, its face hidden behind a veil. It carried a staff made of bone, its tip capped with a crystal that glowed with malevolent energy. The spirits shrank back at once, fleeing into the darkness as if driven by some intangible force. "You trouble yourself with things beyond your comprehension," the figure recited, its voice tolling like a death bell. "The veil asks sacrifice, and you will give it to it." With a sweep of the staff, the walls of the crypt shuddered and distorted, moving in on them. The spirits returned, flying around the party like scavenging vultures. "We must resist," Nazish exclaimed, picking up a piece of jagged glass. "We can't let it triumph." But even as she said it, uncertainty eroded her determination. How could they hope to defeat an entity that had survived for centuries? What opportunity did mere humans have against such long-standing evil? As if divining her trepidation, the veiled figure stepped closer, its own veil dancing on an unseen current of air. Underneath, Nazish glimpsed something horrid. A darkness where a face should have lain, and there was only depthless, moving blackness. "Join us," it breathed, speaking in their very minds. "Embrace the veil." Just as the situation seemed hopeless, Sanya stepped forward, her expression resolute. "No," she said firmly, placing herself between the group and the cloaked figure. "You won't take them." The figure paused, tilting its head curiously. "You dare defy me?" It rasped, its voice layered with menace. "I'm not afraid of you," Sanya replied, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Not anymore." And with that, she made a swift forward motion, plucking the staff from the figure's clutches. An influx of power flashed outwards, and they were both hurled to the floor. The staff thrashed madly, dark energy fizzing in bursts. "What do you think you're doing?" Nazi shouted, hastening to interject. "Finishing this," Sanya said, pushing the staff into the ground with every ounce of force she had. The blast of light that followed engulfed the crypt, dispersing the spirits and sending the hooded figure fleeing. When the light had dissipated, the group fell to the ground, spent but alive. The crypt was quiet, except for the soft buzz of the triggered ward. As they rallied outside the crypt, the claustrophobic air of Karakpur felt a little less oppressive. The whispers had died away, leaving only a tense silence. For the first time since coming into the village, they hoped they might survive after all. But their respite was brief. As they approached the surface once more, the hooded one reappeared in their path. Its veil rippled menacingly, showing moments of the void below. "You have postponed the inevitable," it spoke, its voice heavy with malevolence. "But the veil will return, and when that happens, none of you shall be spared." With that, it disappeared into thin air, leaving only the faint smell of sulfur behind. The survivors walked through the empty streets of Karakpur, their bodies bruised and their nerves worn. The crushing burden of the veil still weighed on them, though it felt slightly less heavy after charging 2 of the 3 remaining wards. Every step they took seemed to ring out abnormally loud in the creepy quiet that shrouded the village. Even the wind, which had screamed non-stop previously, was now merely whispering softly, as if too fearful of disrupting the delicate equilibrium they had reached. Nazish was at the forefront of their line, her hold on the staff unbreakable in spite of the strain written across her face. She looked back over her shoulder at the others, each of them carrying physical and mental scars from their experience. Israr's gash had been quickly bandaged with strips ripped from his shirt, but blood still seeped through the improvised dressing. Sanya moved with her head downcast, her hands shaking a little as she held the map in a tight grip. Raza, who had been the most calm during their travels, now appeared worn out, his face thin and his movements slow. "We're nearly there," Nazish said at last, shattering the strained silence. Her tone was firm, although her eyes revealed the weariness eroding her determination. "The final ward is in the village square." "And then what?" Ainam asked, her tone laced with doubt. "Do we just leave? Act like everything's okay?" "No," Nazish said resolutely. "Triggering all 3 wards will seal the ritual. It'll fix the seal so it's not going anywhere, or as close to not going anywhere as anything gets here." "Permanence sounds good to me," Farhan growled softly to himself, gripping a splinter of shattered timber-like weapon. His knuckles were bleached white, and his eyes flicked frantically toward the shadows that huddled tenaciously at the periphery of the street. Raza spread the map out again, examining it closely. The anchor ward is connected to the village's heart, the fountain in the square. That's where the first ritual was done centuries ago. And where the Veil first escaped, Nadzish continued darkly. If we fail here, all that we've accomplished will come undone. As they entered the village square, the air thickened, as if resisting their movement. The cobblestones they walked upon were broken and uneven, and covered in patches of moss and ivy that seemed to twist palely in the faint light. In the center of the square stood the fountain, a ruined stone edifice covered in carvings of twisted, hideous faces that grinned in agony. Water no longer ran from its spout. Instead, a steady drip of thick black sludge flowed, collected in the basin below. "This is wrong," Huma whispered, holding onto Ainam's arm as she walked. Her voice trembled, and her wide eyes scanned the square as if something would spring at them at any moment. "It is wrong," Raza answered somberly, moving forward slowly. "This is where the villagers did the original ritual, the one that called up the Veil in the first place. Whatever occurred here put a scar on the land itself." Nadzish walked up to the fountain, her boots splashing gently in the thick liquid covering the ground. She studied the carvings intently, tracing her fingers over the detailed patterns. Some of them told stories of agony, men and women ripping at their own faces, children screaming in fear. Others displayed dark figures stepping out from whirling emptiness, their shapes indeterminate, but unmistakably evil. "These symbols," Nadzish whispered, tracing one of the markings with her finger. "They're different from the ones we've seen before." "They're older," Raza explained, joining her. "These are the original glyphs used to summon the Veil. Activating the anchor ward will overwrite them, sealing the entity away for good." "But how do we turn it on?" Umair asked, nervously glancing over at the buildings around them. Their windows glared blankly, somehow ominously, as if empty eyes were watching them. "The same way we turned on the others," Nadzish said, holding up the staff. "We feed energy into it. But this one, we'll have to do it with everyone's assistance." She stood to face the group, her face set. "No matter what comes next, we hold together. If we lose formation, we're dead." The others nodded in turn, their faces white but firm. They stood in a circle around the fountain, hands on the rim of the basin. Nadzish stood at the center, her hands locked around the staff as she started to chant in the old tongue. The symbols on the fountain started to glow softly, filling the square with an otherworldly green light. The whispers grew again, this time stronger, overlapping into a choral conflict of sounds that seemed to emanate from everywhere. Before the ritual could go any further, the earth shook with a violent shudder, cracks spiderwebbing out from the fountain. Dust poured down from the rooftops, and a low rumbling shook the square. Out of the shadows stepped a figure in black, its face hidden behind a veil. It carried a staff made of bone, topped with a crystal that glowed with dark power. "You dare tamper with forces beyond your comprehension," the figure intoned, its voice resonating like a funeral bell. "The Veil demands retribution." The group tightened their formation instinctively, their eyes locked on the entity. Despite their exhaustion, they readied themselves for another fight. "We're not backing down," Nadzish declared boldly, raising the staff defensively. "You've taken enough from us." The statue cocked its head, regarding her inquisitively. Under the veil, the emptiness rippled, showing flashes of twisted tendrils that appeared to move. "Blind mortals," it croaked. "Your resistance only makes the veil stronger." With a sweep of its staff, the fountain went off, spewing geysers of black goo shot into the air. The fluid solidified into humanoid forms, coalescing into ghostly guardians that moved towards the group in stiff, unnatural strides. "Concentrate!" Nadzish bellowed, thrusting the staff into the earth. Energy burst outwards, compelling the spirits to back away for an instant. Raza stood with her, muttering in the old language again. The runes glowed with increased intensity, the green glow radiating in waves. The ghostly wards faltered, their outlines wobbling like candle flames in a breeze. "Keep going," Natsish urged, deflecting a swipe from one of the spirits with the staff. "We're almost there." The others followed suit, channeling their energy into the fountain. The carvings began to shift and change, the grotesque faces melting away to reveal new symbols, ones associated with protection and sealing. But the hooded entity wasn't yet done. Waving its staff again, it called up a cloud of inky blackness that rushed down upon the band, covering them in a palpable shroud. The moaning grew more intense, thread-like whispers passing through their heads. "This is not working!" Sanya shrieked, grabbing at her skull as scenes from old atrocities stormed into her mind. "It's too powerful!" No exclamation mark, Natsish snapped, her voice rising above the turmoil. "Don't let it get the better of you. Concentrate on the ritual." With all the strength they could muster, the group pushed on. The fountain thrashed wildly, its light intensifying with every heartbeat. The hooded figure retreated, its veil streaming as though it were in a storm. "You will not succeed," it spat, lifting its staff for a final strike. But before it could attack, Israr launched himself forward, plunging his dagger into the crystal on the tip of the staff. The ensuing burst of energy sent shockwaves radiating across the square, driving out the spirits and making the figure withdraw. Once the light died away, the fountain remained quiet, its surface calm and undisturbed. The heavy feel of Karakpur lightened a little, to be replaced by a nervous stillness. As the group regrouped, the reality of what they had accomplished began to sink in. The veil was sealed, for now. But the cost had been immense, both physically and emotionally. "We did it," Raza murmured, collapsing onto the ground in exhaustion. "We actually did it." "For now," Natsish amended grimly, her eyes on the horizon. "The veil isn't erased, it's just contained. And if we've learned anything from history, it's that containment breaks eventually." "What do we do now?" Ainam asked, her voice shaking. "Go back to our lives and act like this never occurred?" "I wish we could," Natsish acknowledged softly. "But Karakpur won't let us forget. Not entirely." As morning crept over the village, painting the ruins in pale golden light, the survivors stood among the debris of their trial. They were aware that their task wasn't really complete. The veil was still a threat, biding its time until its next chance to attack. But for the moment, they had gained a reprieve. The survivors stood in the wreckage of Karakpur, their limbs bruised and their nerves raw. Morning had crept over the accursed village, throwing a pale gold light over its empty roads. For the first time in what felt like forever, the stifling pressure of the veil eased, if only in the slightest. The whispers that had shadowed their every footstep were now distant murmurs, barely perceptible under the scrambling leaves and groaning shutters. But none of them could bring themselves to think it was over. Not really. Natsish gripped the staff firmly, her white knuckles showing against the worn wood. She looked at the others, all of whom had the scars, visible and otherwise, of their experience. Israr's bandaged wound bled onto his shirt, Sanya's hands shaking as she held the map they no longer required. Raza rested his weight on a chunk of debris, his gaunt face set in determination. Even Farhan, who had spent most of their trek grumbling about going back, now stood in silence, his eyes flicking over the darkness with suspicion. "We've done all we can," Natsish said at last, her voice firm though her eyes showed the wear eroding her determination. "The wards are up, the seal is set." And yet, Huma's voice faltered, shaking. She pointed to the horizon, where the sun was fighting to cut through the still-present haze. "It doesn't feel finished." "It isn't," Raza answered sternly, opening the journal again. His fingers trailed the worn writing, stopping over a text in the middle. "The ritual that we did, It wasn't only intended to trap the veil, it was intended to make it weaker. But there is one last step. What step? Umair snapped tensely, his voice heavy with apprehension. You didn't tell us this. I didn't know, Raza confessed, guilt crossing his face. Until now. The journal speaks of a core, a material form of the veil itself. If we destroy it, the entity will be gone forever. Where is it? Natsish insisted, advancing. Raza looked around nervously at the others before answering. Underground, under the church. The group walked back to the crumbling church in the center of Kharagpur. Its rough spire stood menacingly against the gray sky, casting ghastly shadows on the courtyard. The enormous oak doors creaked as they pushed them open, exposing the vast interior lit with pale light. Dust motes hung listlessly in the air, disturbed by their entry. At the other end of the nave was the altar, still covered in frayed black cloth. There was one green flame that burned on it, its shadows haunting the walls. Natsish went forward slowly, her boots resonating lightly on the stone pavement. The others trailed behind her, their breathing shallow and urgent. There's something here, Sanya breathed, her finger indicating a portion of the floor partially hidden by trash. Under the filth, there were faint carvings, symbols that were the same as those carved into the fountain and the other wards. This has to be it, Raza whispered, crouching over the inscriptions. He touched his hand to the stone, searching for a secret mechanism. A panel of floorboards emitted a gentle click as it rolled away from them, exposing a steep staircase going down into darkness. Are you certain? Anam asked shakily. What if it is a trap? We don't have a choice, Natsish answered firmly, holding the staff tightly. If we preserve the core intact, the veil will otherwise find another avenue to break open. Each in turn plunged down into the void, his flashlights boring through the choky blackness. The atmosphere was colder at every step, the air cold with the breath of earth and rot. Fanciful patterns on the walls were aglow with a phosphorescent sheen, and changing shape from whatever angle it was seen by seemed to generate a disquieting sense of motion. At the foot of the stairs, they emerged into a great chamber filled with towering black stone columns. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, on top of which lay a glowing crystal orb infused with dark energy. Its surface glowed with an unnatural light, revealing twisted reflections of the group as if ridiculing their appearance. That's it? Raza replied, his voice filled with awe and fear. The heart of the veil. It was too much for anyone to say before the ground shook uncontrollably, cracks spreading in a spider's web pattern out from the pedestal. Dust cascaded from above, and the sound of thunder rumbled deep within the room. From out of the darkness came glowing red eyes, a score of them, watching unblinking. They've found us, Huma whined, slowly backing away. The spirits pressed forward, encircling the group. Their bodies shimmered like candlelight in a gust of wind, their empty eyes burning with pain and fury. Before they could be swamped, the figure in the cloak returned, standing in their way. Its hood billowed ominously, and it revealed glimpses of the emptiness below. You cannot escape, it said, its voice booming like a death bell. The veil requires sacrifice, and you will give it. Natsish advanced, her teeth gritted in defiance. We're not afraid of you anymore, she said, holding up the staff protectively. Your power is waning. The figure cocked its head, regarding her with interest. Under the veil, the emptiness rippled, showing hints of writhing tendrils that appeared to be alive. Foolish mortals, it grated. Your rebellion only makes the veil stronger. With a sweep of its staff, the chamber was thrown into disarray. The columns started to shift and buckle, closing in on them. The spirits reappeared, flying around the group like vultures waiting to pounce. The orb thrashed furiously, its black energy snapping out in unpredictable explosions. We must burn it, Raza cried out, charging toward the pedestal. But before he could get to it, the figure in the hood raised its staff, conjuring a deluge of dark smoke that swirled out at him, surrounding him with shadows. "No!" Nazi shrieked, dashing to his side. She whirled the staff with all her might, scattering the smoke and sending the figure stumbling backward for a moment. "Concentrate on the orb," Israr shouted, pushing away a ghostly sentinel with a crude tool. "Don't let them hinder us." Sanya caught up with Natsish, picking up a piece of shattered glass from the ground. Both of them ran towards the pedestal, focusing their strength into the orb. It glowed more intensely, fighting back against them as if it had a mind of its own. "It's pushing back!" Sanya screamed, covering her head as memories of long-forgotten traumas assailed her mind. "It's too powerful!" "No!" Natsish yelped, her voice cutting through the confusion. "Don't let it win! Concentrate on the ritual!" Gathering all the willpower at their disposal, the group increased their efforts twofold. The orb beat wildly, its light intensifying with every tick of the seconds. The robed figure retreated backward, its veil billowing as if seized by a stormy gust. "You cannot succeed," it spat, lifting its staff for the final attack. But before it could strike, Israr lunged forward, driving his dagger into the crystal atop the staff. The resulting explosion of energy sent shockwaves rippling through the chamber, banishing the spirits and forcing the figure to retreat. As the light dimmed, the orb exploded, unleashing a blinding flash of white radiance. The room trembled with a violence that shook stone chunks loose from the ceiling. The survivors ran for the staircase, barely avoiding being crushed as the building collapsed. They burst into the sunlight gasping, their bodies bruised but alive. Behind them, the church collapsed in ruins, its spire toppling in a cloud of dust and rubble. The stifling air of Kharakpur was lifted altogether, replaced by a tense quiet. For an instant, they dared to hope. Maybe they had done it. Maybe the veil was really gone. But then the whispers came back, soft at first, and then louder until they swirled in the air like a tempest. Out of the ruins of the church came the hooded one, its hood ripped off to show the emptiness underneath. It lifted its staff, its tip aimed squarely at Nazish. "You have postponed the inevitable," it declared, its voice heavy with malice. "But the veil shall rise again, and when that happens, all of you shall be caught." With that, it was gone in an instant, leaving nothing but the lingering smell of sulfur. The survivors traded somber glances, their ties cemented in fire and terror. They knew that they would perhaps never be free of Kharakpur's shadow, but they also knew that they'd survived something that few other people could. As they set out to depart the accursed village, they couldn't help but feel that their triumph was temporary. Weeks later, as they told their chilling story to incredulous friends and relatives, bizarre things started happening to them. Objects floated around by themselves, whispers bounced off vacant spaces, shadows clung beyond their normal lifespan. And then, one by one, they started disappearing, leaving behind just pieces of their previous selves. The final scene shows Natsish alone in her apartment, staring into a mirror. Her reflection smiles cruelly, its eyes glowing red. The whispers grow louder, swirling around her like a storm. "Join us," it whispers, its voice layered with menace. "Embrace the veil." As the screen fades to black, the sound of shattering glass fills the air. Did fractured spirits send chills down your spine? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this terrifying saga with other horror fans. Your support fuels our nightmares and keeps the spirits alive.